So West Yellowstone has always catered to its tourists, and in town there was a restaurant owned by a couple named Brad and Renee Brisbin. On top of owning the restaurant, Brad also had a job at the local high school where he was the cool gym teacher. His students absolutely adored him. Actually, everyone did. He was the super charismatic, trustworthy guy who loved to make people laugh. And on top of being athletic, funny, and smart, he was also pretty on the eyes, if you know what I mean. Let me guess, he also spent his weekends at the animal shelter nursing weak kittens back to health too, right? Brad loved both his jobs, his family, and the tight-knit community in his tiny town. Brad hardly ever missed a day of work, and if he had to, he would let you know way in advance, which was why it seemed so out of the ordinary one day when Brad had to leave class unexpectedly after getting a phone call. As Brad was rushing out, his son Jeremiah saw him in the hall with his coat on and asked where he was going. He said he was going to Belgrade, about 90 miles away, to pick up his friend Larry Moore, who needed a ride. He told him he'd see him at dinner that night and hurried off. And that was the last time Jeremiah would ever see his father again. Jeremiah remembered how odd it felt that his dad had to leave school earlier that day. Even as a kid, he knew that was way out of the ordinary for his dad. But when Brad never came home that night, that's when the family knew that something wasn't just out of the ordinary. Something was wrong. Because that's not how Brad Brisbin behaved, boo-boo. When police interviewed Larry Moore, the friend Brad said he was going to go pick up, he confirmed that the two met at the diner as planned. But Larry was concerned. His friend seemed really depressed and said he thought that Brad might have driven to the diner under the influence because he was slurring by the time he got there. From everything we've learned about Brad so far, does this even sound in character, like at all? But apparently he was just tired of it all, tired of his life, tired of his wife, tired of the restaurant, decided it was time to leave. He asked Larry for some money. Larry handed it over and watched as Brad walked out of the restaurant. He watched Brad get into a red car with Washington plates and said the driver was a woman that he didn't even recognize. The two skirted, like skirt, out of there, like leaving Brad's car in the parking lot. When investigators went to check out the diner, sure enough, there was Brad's car sitting in the parking lot with no signs of foul play. They were like, okay, the story checks out. But his friends and family were like, to the no. Like they were adamant that Brad loved his family. And never did Brad even hint about potentially leaving his wife or talk about running away. They claimed that if that was the story that Larry told, then clearly Larry didn't know Brad. But that was the thing. Larry did know Brad. The Moore and Brisbin families had been tight for years. Brad and Larry were hunting partners, and the two went way back. Larry's wife, Shelly, even worked with Brad at the high school. She coached girls basketball and he coached boys. As the investigators continued to question residents of the town, they caught wind of rumors that Brad and Shelly Moore might have been having an affair. But they quickly found out that they were just rumors. They talked to Renee and asked if she had any suspicion her husband was cheating on her with Shelly, and she was like, what? No, absolutely not. They asked Shelly too, and she also denied it, claiming the affair was a figment of Larry's imagination. Coincidentally, just 2 days before Brad went missing, Larry and Shelly separated. In fact, Shelly was one of the first people to suggest looking into her husband, or I guess ex-husband, about Brad's disappearance. As she continued talking with investigators, Shelly began to paint a very troubling picture of Larry and his behavior during the last few months leading up to his disappearance. So Larry and Shelly had been having marriage issues for a bit, and in October of 1990, Larry suffered a nervous breakdown and was convinced that Shelly was cheating on him with Brad. She wasn't, but he continued to accuse her of it, and by the end of October, Shelly had filed a restraining order against him after he had gotten physically violent with her and put his hands around her throat. But then, a few weeks after Brad's disappearance, the police station was contacted by Brad via snail mail. The letter was from Brad Brisbin, who claimed he was alive and well, living in Washington State. Police took one look at that letter and were not convinced.
Hey Marge, who's that handwriting analysis guy we like? Ask him what he's doing on Thursday.
Meanwhile, a piece of forensic evidence barely the size of a quarter was being analyzed in a lab and was about to turn the entire investigation on its head. Since Larry was the last person who had supposedly seen Brad, detectives asked to search his camper van early on in their investigation. His van was absolutely spotless and looked like it had been cleaned from top to bottom. They found holes riddled in the floor of the camper as well as in the liner underneath. They also found bullet fragments from a .357 Magnum pistol. When they asked him about the holes in the floor, Larry told them that he once found a mouse in a camper on a hunting trip, and they were like, so you fired at it? And he was like, yep. But a little something on one of the curtains in the camper caught the eye of one of the investigators. He noticed this tiny, dark little blob on the curtain that looked like some sort of something. And he was like, hey, can I take this? And legit took the whole curtain off the rod and brought it with him as they left. The test revealed that the blob was a piece of human tissue, a piece of muscle. But before the police could even question Larry about this, another letter arrived from Brad. Definitely not Brad. The letter was postmarked from Washington, and in it he apologized for the strain he caused on everyone. He explained he wanted a new start and a clean slate, and that he had a wonderful woman helping him now. A few days later, Larry Moore got a similar letter in the mail. In Larry's letter, Brad asked him to make sure that Renee was taken care of, and that he drafted up some papers to make sure that she got everything from the marriage, since he was starting a new life with a new person. Well, apparently Brad was so absorbed into his new life, he'd managed to misspell his own wife's name in the first paragraph of the letter. Obviously, the cops hadn't been buying these letters from the start, but by this point, were welcoming them with open arms because it just meant that they had even more evidence to convict Larry. The suspect, sorry. Investigators tested the letters with a chemical that reacted with amino acids and fingerprints. Scientists found numerous fingerprints on both the documents, but none belonged to either Brad or Larry. The next person to examine the letters was a dude with one of the coolest jobs in the world, a forensic document examiner, aka a handwriting analysis expert, or discoverer of forged signatures, if you will. The examiner found that both letters were typed on the same typewriter, and that the paper used was an inexpensive one found in most high schools. They didn't have that in my high school. The only part of the letter that was handwritten was Brad Brisbin's signature, which had been done in cursive. The handwriting expert noticed how the signature was full of tremors, which meant that whoever had signed it had taken their time slowly and carefully doing it. This was a smoking button for the examiner, as signatures are typically done so habitually that there are hardly ever signs of tremor in them. The only time he'd ever seen tremor in signatures was that the person was diseased on something, under severe stress, or was trying to duplicate the handwriting of another person. They compared the signature on the letters against several documents Brad had signed before he had disappeared and discovered some discrepancies. In a birthday card he'd given to someone, Brad had written in all uppercase letters and printed his name in the same uppercase letters as the sign-off at the bottom. It seemed like Brad preferred to print when he wrote, and only signed in cursive on formal documents that required it. But the only thing they could do with that information was prove that Brad hadn't written the letters. It was going to be much more difficult to prove who actually did write them. But what about the human tissue in the camper? Wasn't that evidence enough that Larry had done it? I'm so glad that you asked me. While the tissue was proven to be human muscle, the experts argued that technically people can shed tissue like that without actually being deceased. Ew. To get a second opinion, they sent the tissue to a neuropathologist to examine what part of the body it was from. And he informed that the muscle they'd found was actually a piece of someone's cerebellum. Okay, gross. AKA a piece of someone's brainstem. Whoever this brainstem had belonged to was definitely no longer alive, but they couldn't prove it was Brad's just yet. Jiminy Christmas. They would need Brad's body to compare the DNA evidence with, but Brad's body had they not. But don't worry, because science rules. While they didn't have Brad's DNA to compare the sample to, they did have Brad's children, his mother, and his wife, and that was enough for them to solve it. Since kids get half of their DNA from their mom and the other half from their dad, they could look at all 4 of the profiles and isolate Brad's DNA profile through the process of elimination. The system they used to do this was the most sophisticated DNA test available at the time, and they were able to determine that the DNA profile they picked out was 100% consistent with being the father of the children and the son of the mother. Translation, that was definitely Brad's brainstem. With that discovery came a lot of mixed feelings for the Brisbins. They'd known deep down that Brad was gone, but by now their pain and devastation had turned to anger that his assassin was still walking free, and they wanted justice. Larry was arrested and charged as a suspect in Brad's butchering, and prosecutors knew they were going to have one hell of a time proving he'd done it without the body. With the evidence that they had, they began piecing together a timeline of how they assumed the events went down. Break out the red string and thumbtacks. Prosecutors believe that the two met at the diner, like they had said, and somehow Larry lured Brad into the back of his camper. A ballistics expert compared the location of the brain matter to where the holes in the floor of the camper were, and mapped out with a laser where Larry must have fired from. The expert determined that Brad had been hit while he was either collapsed on the ground or crouched down at the time, and that the suspect had fired from a standing position toward the back of Brad's head. They figured that Larry had probably asked Brad to grab something for him on the floor, and as he bent down to pick it up, he was He was ambushed. Larry fired multiple times, hitting Brad in the shoulder and the head, sending tiny pieces of muscle and tissue flying. But because they were at a busy truck stop with lots of traffic, most likely no one heard the shots ring out. After that, Larry probably took the body somewhere and disposed of it. Larry worked for an excavating company and had access to all types of equipment that could help him hide a body very easily. After dumping the body, they believed Larry steam cleaned the camper and took out the carpet to hide the evidence. All prosecutors had to do was convince the jury of that. At his hearing, Larry pleaded not guilty and denied the charges, which meant that there was now going to be a trial, and sugar, we're going down swinging. Larry's trial date arrived, and prosecutors argued that Larry snuffed Brad in a jealous rage after he was convinced that his wife was cheating on him. To throw them off the trail, Larry wrote some letters and forged some signatures. Larry tried to change his story, saying that he'd found a depressed Brad in his trailer with the pistol and he was in bad shape. Larry thought he was going to do something drastic and said Brad was injured when the two struggled over the pistol. He said he went to get Brad some water, but when he came back, Brad was gone. The jury found Larry guilty and sentenced him to 60 years in prison. It was the first homicide case in Montana to be tried without a body, and it was also the first time in the state that DNA was used in a criminal case. Just 2 years after he was sentenced, Larry made headlines again when he was charged with conspiring to build a detonator in prison. In order to avoid inevitably more years in prison, Larry agreed to lead the authorities to where he'd buried Brad's body. He brought them to a campground where he'd buried his pistol and pointed to a spot underneath a tree. They dug down a few feet, and sure enough, there she was. Then he brought them to a gravel pit outside of West Yellowstone where they finally unearthed Brad's body. He never gave details about what happened or admitted what he'd done. But once they found Brad's body, Larry turned very pale and had to go sit down in the squad car. Oh yeah, dude, for sure. Go take a breather. I'm sure this has all been really tough for you. An autopsy of Brad's body revealed that he had holes in his chest and head from the .357 Magnum, just as the prosecutors had told the jury. He finally confessed to the crime in 2004 when he found out that it would be featured on season 8 of the crime documentary show Forensic Files. In true Larry fashion, he sent letters to the producers of the show where he finally admitted his guilt. In the letter he wrote, "I'm guilty, as charged, and I'm thankful that the truth finally came out. With help from modern technology, I have learned that telling the truth is the only answer." His words provided little comfort to the Brisbin family, however, whose children would have to grow up without a father. Jeremiah Brisbin told the producers of Forensic Files that all he wanted was to get Larry in a room with him, to look him in the face and ask him why. Well, I have good news and bad news for Jeremiah. The good news is that he might very well get the chance to do that soon, because the bad news is that Larry Moore was paroled in 2020 after serving only 28 years out of his 60-year sentence. While his release date hasn't been set yet, 73-year-old Larry Moore will probably walk out of those prison gates one day soon and experience things like iPhones, social media, Reddit for the first time, some TikTok videos. I wonder if he has any idea just how many people in the world now know who he is thanks to the internet. I don't know about you guys, but I think that Larry admitting his guilt and then getting paroled is probably one of the biggest bunch of bagel bun I've ever heard. The Brisbane begged the judge not to parole Larry, but apparently he'd shown enough signs of rehabilitation. Until next time, stay safe, my homies, and please make sure that none of your homies are thinking of committing homicide.